Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at another chess opening, and this is the Sicilian Defense, and it's about the Grand Prix attack. So without further ado, let's look at it. White will begin with playing the move e4, and black will go c5. And already on move 2, we see that white has two different options of how you can play the position. You can either go for f4, which is more of a sideline, or you could go for knight c3, which is the main move. And we're first going to be looking at the move f4. It's more basic and it's easier to understand. If f4 is played here, then black will just go for the move g6, white goes knight f3, and black simply plays the move bishop g7. And white should normally just play the move knight c3 and transpose into what would happen if you played knight c3 on the second move. And you should not really try bishop c4 or c3 because it gives black a very significant space advantage. So after bishop c4, e6, and black is now threatening the move d5. d4, white also tries to strike in the center, and now d5. And here the move bishop b5 check is played. White wants to gain some time and also make sure that black is not going to just develop all the pieces just like that. So after bishop b5, black goes bishop to d7, and the idea is that they want to force white to take on d7, in which case, after takes, you can just take with the knight, and you're completely fine here as black. Even though white has chances of isolating your pawn on the queen side, it's not really a big deal at all, because you just get a very active position. I mean that you could just take on d5 if you were white, and then take on c5, and then the pawn would get isolated, or the other way around. But in either case, even though you do get an isolated pawn, it's not necessarily the worst position, considering that black has a good amount of control, and with some following moves like maybe knight e7 and then castling, black doesn't seem to be too bad in this position. So that was the reason why bishop c4 should not necessarily be played. The other option is to actually just go for the move c3. But that leads to a similar idea. Knight c6, d4, a trade of pawns in the d4 square. d5, it somewhat transposes. And now, if you play the move e5 as white, then black can play bishop g4. And the idea is to simply maneuver this knight to h6 and then to f5. It's a common maneuver. The idea why you do this is because, first of all, you don't want to play e6, because it kind of wastes a bit of time, and it's not really necessary for you to go for the move e6 and then put the knight on e7 and then on f5. It's quicker to go to h6 and then to f5 from there. And another thing is that when that knight goes to f5, it's attacking a key pawn in white's position. And that is the problem that white has here. The pawn is so weak that it can easily be attacked, and all of these pawns that white does have cannot ever protect this pawn on d4. So black is basically able to target the pawn, and white is susceptible to a lot of different ways that black can attack it, like knight h6, knight f5, queen b6. Maybe later on you can go f6 and try to break the position open, get your bishop active because it's at the moment being blunted out by this pawn. So that's basically the idea if you go e5, and if not, then black is just going to have a fine position. You can either take on d5 and activate black's queen, or you could just ignore the pawn on d5 and just develop the knight, but that would just favor black. So this position is really better for black, and white should really consider what to do before they reach this position. So instead of going for the move f4, you could also choose knight c3. And if knight c3 is played, then g6, so black tries to fianchetto. And if you remember from my previous video I made on the Sicilian Defense, I went over the Closed Sicilian. This is what happens in it. So now white goes f4. This is where it kind of branches off. In my previous video of the Sicilian, I mentioned that white could go for g3 and go for somewhat of a fianchetto setup, and then follow up with f4, bishop g2, and knight ge2, or knight f3, etc., etc. But here, white is just going to go straight for f4, and they're not really going to think about fianchettoing their light-squared bishop. So black goes bishop to g7. All normal, just developing the bishop out, and the knight now comes out to f3. So white is now trying to prepare the move d4. So black tries to defend it with knight c6, and here white has two main moves. One move is bishop to c4, and another move is bishop to d5. So both moves are completely fine. Bishop c4 has the idea of immediately trying to strike at this weak pawn on f7, but also just trying to build a long-term attack towards black's position. Now, bishop c4 just targets the pawn on f7 and prepares a long-term attack, but what bishop b5 does is just try to simply get more of a positional way of playing this, not really an advantageous tactical one. So we're first going to be looking at the move bishop to b5, and if bishop b5 is played, then black is simply going to go knight d4. They're going to jump their knight to the center, and it gives white a choice. Do you want to take the knight? Do you want to move the bishop? Or do you want to play something like d3 and keep the position as it is? Well, it turns out the two choices that white has are bishop to d3 and also just to simply castle. Why those two moves? Because if you try something like a4 to defend the bishop with the pawn, then black will simply just go knight f6, developing the knight out. The pawn goes to e5, and now comes the move knight h5. So what is black trying to do with this knight h5 move? Well, for one, they're trying to attack the f4 pawn, and a second thing is that they're now trying to maybe get ideas of f6 and weakening this pawn. So essentially what happens is that you see how black is slowly but surely able to start creating weaknesses in white's position. So now knight d4, cd4, attacking the knight, so knight e2, and now a6 for black. Black attacks the bishop, and the idea is that when the bishop moves somewhere, let's say to c4, then black can go d6. And now you target this e5 pawn, which is extremely weak. You're also trying to prevent the idea of g4 from being played, since your knight is kind of off-sided and you're trying to make sure that it isn't going to be trapped. So a4 doesn't work, but if you try something like knight takes d4, it doesn't work either, because black can just take the knight, and after knight e2, go queen b6. A pretty nice move, if you're going to ask me. Because you're trying to maybe free up moves like d3 later on in the game, and you're trying to maybe point out to white that castling kingside isn't really the best idea when the queen is just eyeing the king straight in the face. So the bishop goes back to d3, and here black could try a slow approach like knight f6, but it's better to just strike fast and strike hard with d5. What is d5 trying to do? Well, it's trying to make white's position a lot more weaker, mainly targeting the e4 pawn, and essentially the idea is that if e takes d5, black can later on go for knight f6 and capture the pawn with an improved position for their knight. So white doesn't really want to take the pawn because that would just improve black's knight, so instead e5. But now black goes f6. And the idea is to simply attack the e5 pawn and basically try to develop your pieces. If e takes f6, then black always has ideas of knight f6, and you get the knight out. And it also frees up this bishop's diagonal. And if you don't do anything, then this pawn is simply loose. So best is to play c4, because if you go for something like ef6, then after knight f6, black has a lot more development, and they're perhaps looking to jump the knight into the e4 square. That's perhaps the main idea, but there are a lot of other ideas that black could think of, like developing this bishop out to g4, and black has a very flexible and easy position to play. So although you could do this after c4, f takes e5, black is generally going to be considered better. Even if you could win this d5 pawn, you still would perhaps give chances for black in this position if you were playing with the white pieces. So knight d4 and a4 aren't necessarily the best moves. Instead, you could either go bishop to d3, or you could simply just castle. Castling is the stronger move, so we're first going to be looking at bishop d3, which, if you just look at this move, you already might have a ton of questions, and the first one being, why would you block your d-pawn? Usually when given this sort of position, you start to ask yourself, what are you doing when this bishop is on d3? First of all, it's blocking the d-pawn, meaning that it's blocking the development of the dark squared bishop. And secondly, this bishop isn't really doing much on the d3 square. Usually you do not want to develop the bishop out to d3 quite early, because it doesn't really have a purpose on d3. unless it's trying to exchange itself off for another bishop, whenever this bishop might come out to f5, for instance, in the Caro-Kann. But in a position like this, it makes you ponder, why did this move bishop d3 be played? Well, the idea is not really to block in the pawn. It's more or less played in the idea of trying to save the bishop from the knight capturing it. So d6, and now white takes the knight and black takes with the pawn. The knight goes to e2, and now what does black do? You might be thinking, well, a couple of ideas that come to my mind are bishop to g4, pinning this knight. Another one could be just e5, defending the d4 pawn, which are all completely fine. Maybe even queen to b6 and defend the pawn this way. But the move that black now plays next is a very strange one. But after you analyze it a bit further, you kind of understand why black decided to go for this move. Black decides to play the move knight f6, and it's simply trying to attack the e4 pawn. But you might also be wondering, why does black just abandon the defense of this d4 pawn? Now it can be captured for free. Well, let's take a look at that. There are three main moves that white can go for here, and they are bishop b5 check, knight takes d4, and also c3. And we're going to be looking at c3 last, and we're going to start with the move bishop b5 check. If bishop b5, white brings the bishop back to the b5 square, where it originally was on. Which makes you wonder, why do you keep bringing the bishop back to b5 and then also back to d3? Well, it turns out that after bishop b5 check, black plays bishop d7, and now white trades the bishops. And instead of playing the move knight takes d7, black instead goes queen takes d7. They are not afraid of knight takes d4. The reason is because if knight takes d4 is played, then black can just take the pawn on e4. Completely fine. And the only difference between white's position and black's position is the number of central pawns that they have. You notice that the pawn on d4 was a doubled pawn, meaning that there was another pawn on the same file, and that pawn was this d6 pawn. So if you notice, white has both of the central pawns left. However, for black, they only have the d pawn left, meaning that white has one less central pawn than black, and also white has slightly less control of some particular squares than black does. Black gave up a doubled pawn, white gave up a central pawn that was doing a very good job on e4. So that's why you cannot really take on d4. Instead, it's also the reason why the move d3 was played. White reinforces the e4 pawn and is now actually threatening the move knight takes d4. So black goes e5, just defending the pawn. And now white castles, black castles, and now f5. And after f5, you might be thinking of starting to panic because now white is getting an attack. But just because an attack is happening doesn't mean it's powerful. An attack cannot be as potent as you think it is. And in this particular case, if you panic now, you might not see a clearer way to exploit white's bluff. Here, black can just go for the move d5. And the reason why d5 is playable is because e4 is defending the f5 pawn. If you can get rid of the base of the defender, or at least the base of the pawn chain, in this case it's c2, but we can't really get rid of the c2 pawn at the moment, try looking for a weaker point. d3, could it be? No, it's defended by the queen. f5 we cannot target because obviously you would activate the rook. So what can you attack? You can't attack c2, d3, or f5. Well then attack e4. And that's what black does with the d5 move. They're attacking the e4 pawn, and they're not necessarily doing it just to get rid of the defender of the f5 pawn and essentially diminish the attack, but they're also trying to maybe undouble their pawns. That is a minor reason, but the major one is mainly due to the attack that white is using to progress in the position. Here, white defends with knight g3, defending the e4 pawn, and now just simply d takes e4. We have d takes e4, and now rook a c8. Black seizes the semi-open c-file, and now with ideas like queen c6 attacking the c2 pawn, you see that now white's attack isn't really as powerful. Black simply diminished it by just removing the e4 pawn, and with future moves like queen c6 attacking the e4 pawn, and then queen b6 sliding over to maybe get ideas of this check later on, you see that white's attack isn't really what it originally was, and how looks can be deceiving, and that you might think that it's an attack, but it's really not. It's just white bluffing and trying to make you panic under pressure. After rook a8, white goes bishop g5, putting pressure on the f6 knight. And here black just goes for h6. Why does black go h6? Well, they're trying to kick the bishop away, and you either have a couple of choices. You can go to h4 and trap your bishop, probably the least likely one. Bishop to d2, and then black could just go g5, and there's no problem there. And you could even take the knight on f6, but you should know that after f takes g6, black is not losing a piece, and they can instead just defend the bishop with fg6, since the rook is nicely defending the bishop. And after this, black is going to play a bishop versus knight endgame if white were to take the knight. If not, then after h6, black is just completely fine. You could either move back and black goes g5, or you could take, and then black is, like I said, completely fine in this position. Nothing too out of the ordinary. So, that was the move bishop d5 check. Now, we could also look at the move knight takes d4. And this is probably the question that most of you are asking. Why doesn't white just take the pawn on d4? Well, it turns out that this pawn is actually defended by the bishop. And if the knight here moves anywhere, this knight on d4 is attacked. So, you use this to your advantage, and now you play knight takes e4. You captured the e4 pawn, a central pawn, that too. And now, if white captures the knight, then you simply grab the knight on d4. You've gotten your material back, but like I said in a previous variation, you have two central pawns and your opponent only has one. And that's a pretty big deal, especially in this position. And after bishop takes d4, yes, you might be thinking, well, white can go c3 and now play after bishop g7, d4. That can be played, even queen f3, and now white is attacking the b7 pawn. But you shouldn't fear now. You just go queen to b6, defend the pawn, and you're also preventing white from castling short at the moment. Of course, white is going to go for something like d4 later on and try to defend the king so that you can eventually castle. But the idea is that black gets a good amount of development, and after a couple of more moves, they don't seem to be doing too bad, actually. So, after queen b6, d4, just castle. Completely fine position. With that being said, there's one last move to look at, and that is to actually play the move c3. What is c3 trying to do exactly? Well, it's trying to get rid of black's pawn in the center, and if you don't want to take the pawn and allow black to capture your central pawn, then this is an okay variation, but it's not necessarily the best one. Here, after d takes c3, d takes c3, castles, castles, here black actually has a very interesting way of developing, and I want you to try finding out what it is. Okay, so the move is actually just b5. What is b5 trying to do? Well, of course, you might be thinking at first that this is a free pawn, you can just capture it, and if queen b6 check, you can go knight to d4, and you have no problem. Well, it looks like that, but after e5, black is simply winning because you're going to lose this knight since it's pinned to the king. And that's basically it for white. There's nothing else that they can do anymore. So, e5 would just be winning on the spot, so you can't capture the pawn. Instead, after the move b5 is played, it's best to rather just go knight g3. And there's another move that you could look at instead of going b5, and we'll get to that in a second. After b5, you can simply just play the move knight g3. Just develop your knight out. And here, you could definitely play b4, try to strike on the queen side. You could develop the bishop out to b7, as this pawn is still not necessarily a threat, which is what black does. Black goes bishop to b7, and it makes sense. Now, if this bishop moves, say, to e2, you're always targeting this e4 pawn, which is extremely weak. So queen to e2. Now white is threatening the b5 pawn, because now you don't have that same luxury of playing queen b6 check, and then just simply capturing the bishop. And instead of really playing something like a6, defending the pawn, h5. Now, why does black just go h5? Well, there are two reasons for this h5 move. One of them is just to threaten this move h4. And another one is that you're actually trying to bait white into playing bishop takes b5. And this may seem like a good move at first. I mean, you just captured a pawn and you seem to be completely better. You're just going to bring the bishop back. But that's not the case, because after black plays something like knight takes e4, the tables are actually turned. If knight takes e4 is now played, you take the knight on e4. And if queen takes e4, you go queen b6 check. That bishop is falling, you have no way to protect it. Let's say you develop this bishop out to e3, you capture on b5. And yes, you might be thinking that you don't have to play bishop e3, you can sidestep, and after queen takes b5, go rook e1. But usually this could be favored for black, considering that white doesn't really have any way of attacking, and black can just defend with something like e6, and there's nothing really impressive here that white has. So that's why b5 is one move to consider, but another one is to simply play e5. And if e5 is played, you're just trying to strike where white is trying to attack. Now, the main idea I see with this e5 move is that if f5 is played, you think about playing this d5 move, attacking this e4 pawn. And if e takes d5, you now get ideas of playing e4, a very brilliant move, I must say. And now if the bishop goes, let's say, to c4 to reinforce the d5 pawn, you capture on f5. And it's a very brilliant way of how you developed all of the pieces. And now after you play something like queen b6, you bring the rook out. You do not have a bad position as black. In fact, I would say that black would be a lot better, considering that this knight could even go to g4, and an attack could later start up, considering the very weak position of white's king. And now it's not white who has the attack, it's actually black, and it's a very nice way of how the tables can turn just like that. So after e5, you just go for the move h3. You don't worry about anything like f5. h3, you could also go queen to e1, which would result in a trade of pawns on f4, and then rook to e8, targeting the e4 pawn. You now get ideas of d5, and that is exactly what you play after the move knight g3. Very simple idea. You just try to weaken white's targets around the king, and then you start striking when it's the right moment. Queen e1 is also a possible move, but instead the move h3. If h3 is played, then you play d5. This is the critical moment of the game, because now you can get this favorable position where you've achieved d5. And like I've said in many videos, and many people also say this, d5 is the main break you want to get in if you are playing the Sicilian. So now after knight g3, you check on b6. You use this very long diagonal to your advantage, and after king to h1, you trade the pawns off, you get rid of some of the tension, and now after rook to e8, black is very good. After rook e8, black gets a very good amount of development, and they are very coordinated, and after something like bishop b7 later on, black doesn't seem to be too bad. So that was the move bishop to d3. The other move that could be played is just to simply castle. And if castles is played here, then just e6, and now the move d3. And after d3 is played, you have the option of just taking the bishop. And instead of going d3, you could also look at what happens if e5 is played, in which you don't take the bishop. The reason is because you've now weakened the d6 square severely. And you might be thinking, how can white take advantage of that? Well, white can actually jump in with the knight to e4, and then to d6, or to b5, assuming that you capture. Now d6 is extremely weak, and if you want to defend it, you'd have to play bishop f8. This is a very, very ugly position for black. Yes, black can now develop, but I think that the fact that black has moved the bishop out to g7 and then back to f8, it really bothers me, and then now you cannot really get as easy as development. Of course, I'm not saying it's impossible to develop, but it's very ugly, this position. You just wasted a couple of moves. Whereas you don't have to take the bishop, and you can just play something like a6, ensure that the bishop can never get into the b5 square again. So now bishop d3, you trade the knights off, and now d5, you strike in the center. And here, white will play e takes d6 en passant, and queen takes d6. b3, knight f6, bishop b2, castles, knight a4, and now you go knight d7. You're offering a trade of bishops, and you're generally going to be favored in this position. Because, well, I mean, after you trade the bishops off, you later on get ideas of rook b8, b5. So it's a very good position if you are playing with the black pieces. Now, of course, you don't have to go for the move e5. You could instead play the move d3 as well. And after d3 is played, you go knight e7. So what are you trying to do? You're just develop. You don't really care about what's actually happening. So the knight takes on d4, and now you just take with the pawn. White brings the knight back to e2 and hopes to go for c3. And now black simply castles, and white goes for bishop to a4. And black manages to get the d5 move in. White goes e5, and after f6 we have a trade of pawns. Note that you cannot really take the pawn on d4 because fe5, fe5, and then bishop e5. And black gets rid of the double pawn, and he gets rid of white's very nice central control. So ef6, bishop f6, and now bishop to b3. And yes, there are chances for both sides, but I would really prefer playing black with moves like knight f5, and then later on going into e3, or just go a5 and strike on the queen side, or b5 and then develop the bishop out this way. So many possibilities for black to go for. So that was the move bishop to b5, which makes sense, just trying to go for a more positional approach. Now let's go for the dynamic one, bishop c4. And after bishop c4 is played, what is white trying to do? Well, I mentioned earlier that white wants to get an attack with f5 later on in the game, and follow up with d3, castles queen e1, bring the queen out. You have a very nice position as white. So this is the way to refute the attack. Now, I put a video up on the Grand Prix attack when it comes to white playing it, and I showed you all the ways that white can try attacking. But now let's look at how black can try defending. After bishop c4, we have the move e6. Black blunts the power of the light-squared bishop, and it makes sense. When the bishop is targeting a very weak point in your position, the least you could do is try to make it a little less active, which is what black does. After e6, you do weaken d6, but at the moment there's not really an easy way of getting into it, because of knight b5 you can always go d6 as black. So here, the move castles was played by white. White finishes the development, and another move you can think about, which we'll look at a bit later, is f5. And if white castles, then you simply play knight g7. And now, it's harder for white to go for the move f5. Why, you might be asking? Well, it's because now there's more reinforcements on the f5 square. And even if you play f5, black could actually be fine with playing something like gf5. And after e takes f5, just capture with the knight. And they can actually go for the move d5 later on. So f5 isn't really possible here. You kind of have to go for something like e5 or d3. If d3 is played, then you go d5, kick the bishop back, the bishop goes back to b3, you castle, queen e1, and now you go knight f5, attacking the bishop. Queen h4, you're trying to attack, and now black plays knight ec6, willing to trade the queens off. And this is because if you transpose this position into an endgame, this would actually be better for black. So after knight ec6, you might be thinking, well, why doesn't white just go knight g5? Well, because black can just go h6 and kick the knight back, and then you could trade the queens off and have a better position. So the move queen to f2 was played. Because if you trade the queens off, here's a sample variation, you take the bishop on b3 first. Because now you're attacking the rook on a1. And now after a b3, e d5, you have a very good position. You're going to bring the bishop out to e6. Pretty nice. And also, if you don't take the queen, and if you instead go for queen to f2, then there's b6. Just defend the pawn. And now, black has a very nice position. So instead of going for d3, you could also go for e5. And if e5 is played, then you go d5. Now en passant, queen takes d6, knight e4, queen c7, and here d3. Why do you not take the pawn on c5? Well, it turns out this pawn is a poison pawn, and if you actually capture it, there's knight d4. You bring an attack towards the knight. You're also attacking this bishop if the knight ever moves. And how does white really defend the knight? If you go b4, then you can take on f3 and then capture the rook on a1 for free. And if you don't do anything here as white, then you're just going to lose a lot of material. So you can't really capture the knight on d4 because bishop d4 and you lose the knight, or even queen c5 and then this knight's pinned, so you could later on just capture the bishop. It's a very nice position for black, and that's why you cannot go for the move knight c5. So instead, d3. You defend the knight, and you're getting ready to play bishop e3 and then pressure the c5 pawn. And now black defends with b6, and they're getting ready to fee and shadow the bishop, maybe castle kingside, and then bring the rook out to d8 and have a good position. It's not really a bad one for black at all, and I would say that white has a very slim chance of actually breaking through here. So that was the move castles. You can also think about what happens if f5 is played. If f5 is played, the knight ge7. Now black is threatening moves like ef5 or gf5, preferably gf5 to keep this light squared bishop's diagonal a bit closed. So white is going to play fe6. And they get rid of their very strong f-pawn. But now they have opened up the f-file, and if you are not careful, then definitely there can be an attack down there. So castles, d3, knight a5, attacking the bishop. The bishop goes back to b3, and now you take on b3, a takes b3, and you go e5. Why do you block your bishop in? Well, yes, you are blocking the bishop on g7 in, but you're allowing the light squared bishop on c8 to come out. You notice that there's not really a very optimal square for this bishop to be on if you do not go for e5 and shut your own bishop in. Because if you try b6 and then go bishop b7, then you don't really see the purpose of that. And the bishop isn't really doing much on the diagonal, mainly because it's blunted by the pawn on e4. So with e5, you try to maybe seek play on the king side with something like bishop g4, but mainly the bishop's aim is to go to the e6 square. So queen to e1, you break out of the pin, and now if bishop g4, you can move the knight and then later on kick the bishop away, but black is fine with that. They just go f6. And why f6? Well, because you want to prevent future attacks later on. And after f6, what does white do? Well, white continues the attack. Black goes bishop e6, completely unfazed by all of white's attempts. And after this, black has really nothing to worry about. A simple move like knight to d4 is actually very nice for black. And even follow-up could be a6, b5. And black isn't actually too bad here. And in fact, it's white who should maybe reconsider how to go about this game. So, after the move king takes g7, that leads us to the end of the Grand Prix variation. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.